Hi, I'm Dan Lewis, and I'm delighted to be able to assist you in your study of the Gospel of the Beloved Disciple, or as we are more familiarly used to calling it, the Gospel of John. For the facing page here, I've chosen to display a carpet page from the Lindisfarne Gospels, which is the earliest full English translation of the Gospels going back to about the 10th century. The Lindisfarne Gospels were produced on Holy Island, or Lindisfarne, in northern England, just below the border of Scotland. The original text is in Latin from the Latin Vulgate and is wonderfully illustrated, as you can see from this introductory page to the Gospel of John. But then in about the 10th century, the Latin text was supplemented with an old English sort of word-for-word translation between the lines of Latin, and it becomes the earliest translation of the Gospel of John into the English language. In this introductory area, I want to talk first of all about the text of the Gospel of John, which comes to us from the early manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. The earliest manuscripts of the Greek New Testament all are produced on papyri or papyrus sheets, which is a kind of an early form of paper, I suppose you could say. It is really made from crushed reeds, which grow along the river, particularly the Nile River, and they are crushed in kind of a crosshatch pattern to form a sort of paper. The good part about it is it's relatively inexpensive. The downside is that it's very biodegradable. What you see here is what is called P52. This is a fragment of the Gospel of John, and it is the earliest fragment that we have of the Gospel of John. In fact, it is very likely the earliest fragment we have of any part of the New Testament. Probably dates to about AD 125, something like that. And so what I've done here is just to kind of give you a feel for some of these early fragments that we have of the Gospels. You can see the actual fragment itself, and if you follow my cursor, you can look at the early Greek text that is on this particular piece. This fragment is in the John Rylands Library at the University of Manchester in kind of a bit toward the north of England. And on the right, I have the actual Greek text that you have both, first of all, in what is called unsealed text, that is capital letter text, and then in minuscule text. For those of you that might be able to read Greek, the minuscule text is the text that we typically would read in a Greek New Testament. However, the unsealed text, which is all capital letters, is the text that we would read in some of the very early manuscripts. And as you can see, even though I've given you the lines of text and below that the translation, you can see from the yellow parts of the text, these are the parts that actually are in this particular fragment of the Gospel of John. There is another side, of course, to this fragment, and it is written on the other side as well. But I've just showed you this one side to kind of give you a feel for what some of these early fragments look like. In fact, I'm going to show you two more early versions of the Gospel of John. This one is called P66. This is the Bodmer Papyrus 2, which is in the Bodmer Library in Geneva, Switzerland. And this is very possibly one of the two earliest copies of the Gospel of John. I'll show you the other one in a moment. You can see that it also is written on papyrus sheets. It is also in the form of a codex, which means it is bound on one side. Apparently, the early Christians were the ones who seem to have invented the codex. Prior to the Christian era, at least, texts like this were written on scrolls. And of course, on a scroll, you can only write on one side as the scroll is rolled up on a spindle. In this kind of a text, however, because it's bound on one side in pages, you can actually write on both sides of each of the pages. And so a few things that you may notice is that largely speaking, there's no spacing between the words. This is something that is up to the reader to decide how to divide the words in the line. There's also no such thing as what we would call capitalization and lower letters or lowercase letters. They are all really in the same case. And another rather interesting feature of these kind of early manuscripts is that very often, in fact, in most cases, they are going to abbreviate divine names, such as the word for God or the word for Jesus, and usually with a little line over the top. So if you look at this text, you're going to see, for instance, look at the second line, the fourth and fifth letters. You're going to see what is a Greek theta and then a Greek sigma. These are in unsealed text, and then a line over the top. This is the first and the last letter of the name God. The name God in Greek is 4 letters, but typically in these early Greek manuscripts, the name of God is abbreviated, and then the line is given over the top to denote that this is an abbreviation. If you want to look through this page, you will see a few other places where you're going to find abbreviations of that type as well. The other copy that is just from about the same period of time, maybe slightly later, would be this text, which is in the Vatican Library in Rome. This particular text is also dated to the early 200s. And you will notice that it has a space here, which actually means that this is the division point between the end of the Gospel of Luke and the beginning of the Gospel of John. And once again, you're going to see abbreviations for the names of God. If you look carefully here where my cursor is, you'll see a 2-letter word with a line over it, and then in the next line below it, another 2-letter word with a line over it. Both of these represent the name of God, and they are abbreviated as well. So with just a little bit about the text, now let's talk a little bit about the testimony of this person who has composed the 4th gospel, who is called the beloved disciple. It is one of the, I suppose, ironies, you might say, of the 4th gospel, that while he is described as the disciple Jesus loved, he is never named. But at the same time, he provides an important testimony to the life, the ministry, the death, and ultimately the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the first and the most important feature of this kind of testimony, and this is the kind of testimony you find also in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but this kind of testimony is the testimony that is composed within the living memory of the events that they talk about, roughly over a period of about 3 to 6 decades. Jesus is crucified and risen from the dead sometime in around 30 AD or the early 30s AD. There's some debate about the date of that, and I won't get into that at this point, but sometime in the early 30s AD. The Gospels themselves are going to be written before the end of the 1st century, at least the canonical Gospels. Now, this is important because this means that in the writing of the canonical Gospels, they are put in script within the living memory of the people who actually heard Jesus teach, or who had seen Jesus, or who had followed Jesus as some of his disciples. These kind of eyewitness participants in the events of the Gospels are going to circulate among the Palestinian Christian communities for the first several decades of the Christian church. And those memories of these early disciples are at the disposal of the whole church. So when a text is written, there is sort of a built-in validation of the authenticity of that text, simply because it is circulating within the memory, within people whose memory goes back to Jesus personally. That is something that could not be said, for instance, of later testimonies about Jesus that you find in something like, say, the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Judas. The Gnostic texts are written in the 2nd century, and some of them fairly late in the 2nd century. And so by the time the Gnostic Gospels are written, there were no living people who had seen Jesus personally or who had listened to Jesus personally. So for those later texts, and those have become kind of well known, at least in these days. The Gospel of Judas was published, for instance, in the National Geographic magazine. We'll actually talk a little bit about that at a later point in these lectures. But none of them have the corroboration of those people who had known Jesus personally. No one could, for instance, raise their hand and say, wait a minute, that's not what Jesus said, or that's not what Jesus did. The Gnostic Gospels are all written in a period when that kind of corroboration was not possible. By the same token, the canonical Gospels are by far the earliest of these kind of accounts, and they were written within the living memory of those who had known Jesus personally. So these are the living witnesses of the early church. And among those, of course, were the apostles themselves, the people that Jesus chose, and he separated them out from the rest of his larger body of disciples and said that they were to be his special witnesses. And they serve as guarantors for the accuracy of the traditions about Jesus, both before they were written down and then after they were codified in what we call the 4 Gospels. So this 4th Gospel is one of these records, one of these that were written within the living memory of those who had known Jesus personally. Indeed, the 4th Gospel directly claims to have been composed by an eyewitness. Very early in the Gospel of John, in the prologue, you will have this statement in the 1st chapter where the writer says, "We saw his glory." Now, this seems to be the kind of testimony that is given by an eyewitness. And then particularly at the end of his gospel, he's going to end his gospel by saying, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony about Jesus is true. So these are the kinds of statements that give a level of authenticity to the Gospel of John that you do not find in later writings among the Gnostics. Now, the witness in the Gospel of John is an eyewitness, but he is often an anonymous figure. We never do discover his name in the Gospel of John. He is simply described in several passages as the disciple that Jesus loved. Now, that is an intriguing description because we would assume that Jesus loved all of his disciples, but there was something apparently special about this particular disciple, and so he's always described by this title, the disciple Jesus loved. And no one seems to take offense at this. Now, there have been several speculative ideas about why he was singled out in this way. Perhaps he was young. Maybe all of the other disciples were a bit older, but this was a very young disciple, and so Jesus took special care with this disciple just because of his youthful age. That's a guess. We don't know that for sure, but at least it's an interesting possibility. He does appear occasionally without that designation, the disciple Jesus loved. Sometimes he just appears as an anonymous figure, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So these are the appearances of the beloved disciple in the 4th Gospel. Probably the first appearance is when he is an unnamed companion of Andrew. Now, this happens very early in the gospel, in the 1st chapter, and this seems to be a fairly typical kind of thing that you find in ancient histories of the 1st century. Authors often refer to themselves in the 3rd person in their narratives, sometimes without naming themselves, but sort of I guess you could say an anecdote that serves as a personal signature to the gospel. You find this, for instance, in the writings of Thucydides and Xenophon, even Julius Caesar. You find it in the writing of Flavius Josephus. So this is not an unusual thing for an early historical account. But then when you get to near the end of the gospel, particularly in Jesus' last week in Jerusalem, at the Last Supper, you're going to find that the disciple Jesus loved is seated immediately next to Jesus. And this is where you begin with that language of the disciple Jesus loved. And he is going to also appear at the trial of Jesus. He's going to gain entrance, for instance, into the court of the high priest because he was known to the high priest. You're going to find him at the cross. Apparently, so far as we can tell, the only male disciple who was present when Jesus died. There are a group of women, and then there is this one male disciple, and then all of the other disciples have fled for fear and don't seem to be present at the death of Jesus. And then you're going to find him at the empty tomb after the resurrection on Easter morning. In fact, the beloved disciple is going to be the very first person to come to faith in the risen Lord even before he had seen him. Now, Jesus, of course, is going to appear to the other disciples, particularly the apostles, but this disciple, the beloved disciple, is going to see the empty tomb, and the record of the fourth gospel is that he saw and he believed even before he had seen Jesus personally. And then we find him in a group of 7 disciples in a scene in Galilee where they have all gone north and they have gone fishing. And in this particular case, several of these disciples are named, but the beloved disciple is not named, even though he appears to be part of this group. So it is this peculiarity of the fourth gospel that while it describes the author as the beloved disciple, it does not give this disciple's name. And that introduces a bit of an ambiguity that we need to discuss because this is part of the background of this gospel. If he was the unnamed companion of Andrew, as seems to be the case, then he was initially a follower of John the Baptist. Later in the history of the early church that Luke composes, which we call the book of Acts, he's going to mention those who had been with Jesus from the baptism of John all the way until his ascension into heaven. And this beloved disciple seems to belong to that group. So his appearances in the narratives are almost always in the vicinity of Jerusalem. Now, partly that has to be true because the places where he appears is often connected with Jesus last week in Jerusalem. So he appears at the Last Supper, the trial of Jesus, at the cross, and at the empty tomb. But there may be actually another reason why a lot of the things happen in the vicinity of Jerusalem, and especially why a number of the narratives in the life of Jesus happen in the city of Jerusalem. In fact, the only time he doesn't seem to be in Jerusalem is when he is in this group of 7 disciples after Jesus had risen from the dead. And this is in Galilee, and he seems to be one of the 2 unnamed disciples on that particular occasion. So we can only kind of draw a few clues about his identity from his brief appearances in the gospel. These are the kinds of things that we can glean from the gospel itself. First of all, he's not Andrew, because he's with Andrew. He seems to be distinguished from Simon Peter, and he seems to be distinguished from Judas Iscariot. So he's not any of those. He is personally acquainted with the high priest and some of the staff of the high priest. Now, that's an interesting feature, simply because that suggests that he probably lives in or around the area of Jerusalem. He owns a home, possibly in Jerusalem. He takes Jesus' mother Mary into his own home. And while we don't know where that home was, the likelihood is that it was probably in Jerusalem or its environs. So if that is true, then he may not have traveled with Jesus during the Galilean ministry, which was in the north. That would account for the fact that many of the stories that happen in the Gospel of John happen in Jerusalem. So it also might account for the idea that the homeowner who in whose home that Jesus held the Last Supper with the disciples, the homeowner may have actually been the beloved disciple. At least it was customary for the homeowner to sit beside any honored guest. You find that, for instance, expressed even in the Gospel of Mark. And so since the beloved disciple is sitting immediately next to Jesus, that at least suggests that he might be the owner of this home where the Last Supper was convened. When we see the last appearance of the beloved disciple, which is in this group of 7, at the end of the gospel, he doesn't seem to be Thomas. He doesn't seem to be Nathaniel. He doesn't seem to be either of the 2 sons of Zebedee, which are James and John. And of course, earlier in the gospel, he's been distinguished from Simon Peter. So that leaves 2 unnamed disciples in this group of 7, and presumably the beloved disciple was one of those. Now, I do realize that it is traditional to understand him to have been John, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James. We'll come back to that in a moment. That may or may not be true, but at least the gospel itself does not have that kind of an indication. The unlikelihood of him being either Thomas or Nathaniel or James or John, bar Zebedee, is the fact that the term the disciple Jesus loved is used in these last stories in the Gospel of John, and it doesn't seem to be talking about James or John bar Zebedee. So the reader naturally would suppose that the beloved disciple is one of the 2 unnamed disciples that's mentioned early in John chapter 21. Now, let's go to the testimony of the early church. Since the Gospel of John is anonymous, and in the earliest forms of the Gospel, there doesn't seem to be any title, such as we would think of it today, the Gospel of John, we need to go to the testimony of the early church. And probably the most significant of these, certainly the earliest of these, is going to be Papias. Papias is going to be reflecting on an earlier period of his life when he was interviewing people who had known Jesus personally. And he cites actually several disciples that he interviewed. Probably this is going to be around 80 AD, something like that. This is what he says. Now, this is recorded in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, which is the earliest history, at least full history of the early Christians. Eusebius, of course, is later than this time, but he is collecting the ancient texts and the ancient descriptions of earlier people who had been important for the history of the early church. And so this is what Papias says. I inquired about the words of the elders. And you'll notice that the people he's talking about are people who had known Jesus personally. What Andrew or Peter said, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew. Now, these that he mentions here in this list, these are all apostles of Jesus. These are people who were with Jesus from the beginning, all the way through his earthly ministry and all the way to his death and resurrection. But then he mentions 2 others, whatever Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. So here are 2 disciples that were close to Jesus. Excuse me. Were close to Jesus. They were disciples of Jesus, and yet they don't seem to be part of the 12 apostles, Aristion and the elder John. Now, if you look at the order in which Papias names these apostles, he's going to actually name them in the order they appear in the 4th gospel. The only exception would be Matthew. Matthew is added later. But Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, and John, these are all mentioned in the fourth gospel and pretty much in the order in which they appear in the first gospel. And then, of course, there are these two extra disciples. The two disciples that do not appear by name in the Gospel of John are Aristion and the one that he calls John the Elder. So what that means is that in the circle of intimate disciples of Jesus, there are at least two with the name John. There is the one that we know most about, and that is John bar Zebedee, or John the son of Zebedee, who was the brother of James. James and John were fishermen in Galilee. Jesus had called them, and we find this in the other Gospels very early in his ministry. He calls them, and they leave their nets, and they follow Jesus. But then he's going to also mention this one called John the Elder. They don't seem to be the same person because they're mentioned in the same sentence as separate people. Now, it is also interesting that the two New Testament letters, the little short one-pagers, 2 John and 3 John, are directly cited as being from the elder. Now, to be sure, they don't have the name John, but the fact that they have the name the elder seems to suggest that they are talking about this individual of whom Papias talks about, the elder John. Now, the author of 1 John doesn't use a name or a title, but he does consider himself to be one of the eyewitnesses. And we generally believe that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are all written by the same individual. So the reference to the fourth gospel, the earliest reference we have is in what is called the Muratorian Canon. This is a list of New Testament writings that the early Christians considered to be authoritative. And in this particular list, the fourth gospel is simply called John. It is the Gospel of John. Well, that, of course, raises the question, which John? Is it John bar Zebedee or is it John the Elder? It may be significant, and I suppose it depends upon how much weight you give to this, but it may be significant that in this early canon list, John is described as a disciple as opposed to Andrew, who's described as an apostle. Does that suggest then that maybe the John to whom he is referring is John the Elder, who would not have been one of the 12 apostles? So that might suggest that the author of the fourth gospel wasn't one of the 12, even though he was an eyewitness and a very close disciple of Jesus, the disciple whom Jesus loved. By the time we get to the writings of Irenaeus in AD 180, he is also going to speak of John, the disciple of the Lord, as the author of the fourth gospel. But again, it may be significant that he does not use the word apostle. Is that simply incidental or is that significant? Scholars debate that. When he mentions John at various times in his writings, and Irenaeus does this several times, he never calls him John the son of Zebedee. And he doesn't call him John the brother of James. He just simply calls him John, the disciple of the Lord. He does imply, however, that the author of the fourth gospel was an apostle. But on the other hand, Irenaeus doesn't always use the word apostle simply to refer to the 12. So this is part of the ambiguity of the authorship of the fourth gospel. And scholars debate these kinds of things. They work their way through them in a number of ways. Some of them arguing that the author of the gospel of the fourth gospel was in fact John, the brother of James, and others arguing that he was not. In fact, he was John the Elder, who was not one of the 12 apostles. One of the best works on this whole issue, if you want to do further reading, would be the work of Richard Bauckham, who was a professor at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. This is he wrote a lot of things, Dr. Bauckham, but this may be his magnum opus, one of the last of things that he wrote extensively. And it is a book simply titled The Eyewitnesses. I would actually refer you to that if you want to do some further research. Now, by the time you get near the end of the 2nd century, Polycrates is going to speak of John who leaned back on the Lord's breast, but then he's going to describe him as a priest wearing the priestly ephod or the frontlet. This is also recorded in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History. So if John was a priest, that explains, first of all, the situation in John 18 where he's acquainted with the high priest. It would be natural for a priest to know the high priest. And of course, as the story tells us, he's able to admit Peter into the high priest's courtyard. So that would make sense of that. It is not impossible that he was the same John that is referred to in the book of Acts in chapter 4. There is a John in Acts chapter 4 who is part of the priestly company. That's a little more ambiguous because the name John was, in fact, quite a familiar name in the 1st century. So there are many people who bore that name. But in any case, if he was a priest, he probably was not John Bar Zebedee. It would be unlikely for there to be a priest who was a fisherman in Galilee who would be personally known to the high priest in Jerusalem. Not an impossibility, but not very likely. On the other hand, if he is the John who is mentioned in Acts chapter 4, then he is not John Bar Zebedee because he's distinguished between him in that narrative. In any case, by the time we get to later church fathers, when we get to the early 3rd century and so on, they are going, and later, they're going to more directly identify the author of the 4th gospel with John Bar Zebedee. So you'll find this in the writings of Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, in the writings of Origen and so on. These would be in the 3rd and 4th century and so on. So by the time you get that late in the history of the church, there had been kind of a consensus among a number of the leaders that the author of the 4th gospel was John Bar Zebedee. But when you go to the earlier witnesses of Papias and Polycrates, that seems less than certain. So there are a number of alternative theories. I won't really spend much time with those. Some have suggested Lazarus because Jesus loved him. That seems a fairly weak foundation. Some have suggested maybe it was Matthias because he is the 12th apostle. Again, very nebulous that. Some would say John Mark simply because his name is John, but that seems a little unlikely, particularly because John Mark is the author of the 2nd gospel, the one that we call Mark's gospel, which is the testimony of Simon Peter as Peter tells it to Mark. So that one's not too likely. Some have suggested Thomas because Thomas is invited to touch Jesus' side, and the beloved disciple is the one that saw Jesus pierced with a spear. But again, that could be simply incidental. There is even the notion that maybe Mary Magdalene wrote the gospel, the 4th gospel. That's based on some passages in Gnostic literature. That seems quite unlikely as well. And then there are some arguments by some scholars that say it was written by a disciple of the beloved disciple. So in other words, not a 1st century person, but probably a 2nd century person. And this sometimes is then credited to the community of the beloved disciple. Again, I would suggest that that's a questionable idea. In fact, all of these alternative theories, I think, are rather weak. That the 2 strong candidates are going to be John, the son of Zebedee, and John the elder, both of whom are named John, and arguments on both sides. So that's basically what you have in terms of the authorship of the 4th gospel and the way that scholars are treating it. Now, let's take some time and compare the 4th gospel with the synoptic gospels. The synoptics, of course, being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, very similar to each other. The 4th gospel is unique in that it takes a different line than either Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and that's been long recognized. The portrait of Jesus in the 4th gospel really is a fairly different presentation than you find in the synoptic gospels. The narratives about Jesus' public ministry are mostly different. Now, there are a few stories, such as, for instance, the feeding of the 5,000 and the stories about Jesus' arrest and trial, death, and his resurrection. Those are going to be common to all four of the Gospels. But most of the stories that you find in John's Gospel are only in John's Gospel. The turning of water into wine, for instance, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, for instance, the healing of the man born blind, for instance. All of these are stories that are just in John's Gospel and are not in the other Gospels at all. Furthermore, the geographical location of Jesus' ministry is largely in and around Jerusalem, at least in the fourth Gospel. Now, that doesn't at all suggest that Jesus did not have a ministry in Galilee. It just simply says that in the fourth Gospel, it is those parts of Jesus' ministry that are in and around Jerusalem that are the focus in the fourth Gospel. And so while Matthew, Mark, and Luke are going to spend a lot of their material on what happened to Jesus when he was in Galilee, the Gospel of John is going to spend most of its focus on what happened to Jesus when he was in Jerusalem. And there's one other interesting feature, and that is it is from the fourth Gospel that we glean the idea that the ministry of Jesus is probably about 3 years long. And the reason that is the case is because the fourth Gospel is going to describe 3 different Passovers. Well, since Passover only happens once a year, 3 Passovers put you up in the general vicinity of around 3 years for the ministry of Jesus. Certainly more than 2 years, but more than likely up near the 3-year mark. Whereas when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you didn't have the Gospel of John, you might suppose that Jesus' ministry only lasted a year. At least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's only clearly described 1 Passover. But John's Gospel tells us that Jesus' ministry was longer than that. So these differences don't necessarily imply contradictions, and I'm not suggesting that at all. I think what they do is they mark the fourth Gospel as a unique portrait of Jesus that is partly in some parts similar to what you have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but in a lot of ways is filling out the larger picture of the life of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus that is not described in the Synoptics. There are some other differences between the fourth Gospel and the Synoptics. For instance, the Synoptics have many references to the kingdom of God, or in Matthew's Gospel, the kingdom of heaven. In the fourth Gospel, there are only 2, and they're right together. In Jesus' statement to Nicodemus, he was not born again, cannot see the kingdom of God. But the kingdom of God, at least the phrase, the kingdom of God, is not a common phrase in the fourth Gospel. Another difference that many have noted over the centuries is that the Synoptics have many parables, and the fourth Gospel has no parables. That's especially remarkable since in the Synoptic Gospels, it says that Jesus often did teach in parables. But apparently in the scenes that are described in the fourth Gospel, the beloved disciple has chosen narratives that don't seem to feature a parable of Jesus. Rather, what the fourth Gospel does, it describes Jesus' teaching in some very lengthy discourses. In fact, they are for the most part much longer than the discourses that you find in the Synoptic Gospels. Another thing that's a difference is that in the Synoptics there are frequent exorcisms in which Jesus expels evil spirits from people, but in the fourth Gospel there are no exorcisms. They just aren't part of the storyline. And in the Synoptics, Jesus cleanses the temple when he comes to Jerusalem that last time, just a few days before his death. In the fourth Gospel, the beloved disciple places the cleansing of the temple early in Jesus' ministry. And that raises a question: did Jesus cleanse the temple twice? Or is there some sort of a sequential difference between the way that the Gospels are going to describe this event? Finally, and this we will address later in this series of lectures as well, in the Synoptics, the death of Jesus occurs on the Passover. In the fourth gospel, the death of Jesus occurs the day before the Passover. Passover, of course, begins at sundown. Jesus is crucified in the morning, and in the fourth gospel, he is crucified on the day that the lambs would be slaughtered. And so Passover would not begin until evening of that day. So why is there a calendar difference between the Synoptics and the fourth gospel? So all of these kinds of things, we're going to talk about these a bit later. But here at the beginning, I just wanted to point out to you some of the unique features of the fourth gospel. The early leaders of the Christian church tended to explain these differences by treating the fourth gospel as kind of a supplement to the Synoptics. It's generally agreed that the fourth gospel is probably the latest of the gospels, probably written in the 90s AD, whereas the Synoptic gospels all seem to have been written earlier. And so the early church fathers explained these differences by basically saying John's gospel, or the fourth gospel, adds those things that would fill out the ministry of Jesus. In fact, here's a quote, once again from Eusebius. The earlier Christians say that the beloved disciple provided what was lacking in these other gospels of the deeds done by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. They say, therefore, that the apostle John, and you notice here that Eusebius is going to give credit to the authorship of the gospel to the apostle John. They say, therefore, that the apostle John, being asked to do it for this reason, gave in his gospel an account of the period which had been omitted by the earlier evangelists. So essentially, this testimony suggests that the fourth gospel is a supplement to the three synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, that explanation probably doesn't cover all of the differences, and it doesn't explain some of the differences. It doesn't explain the difference between the calendar of the gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke as opposed to the fourth gospel. But at least I think in the broad sense, we would have to agree with these early Christian leaders that the gospel that we call the Gospel of John is, in the broad sense, it is a supplementary account of the life of Jesus, which is very important for our full understanding of Jesus. Now, I want to finish this introduction to the Gospel of John by talking about its structure. This gospel has a more apparent structure than perhaps some of the other gospels, and it naturally divides into four major sections. There is, first of all, a prologue, which is the first 18 verses. Now, this is a hymn. We call it a hymn because it has a lot of poetic character to it. I don't know that it was ever set to music, so don't think of it a hymn necessarily in that sense. But it is a very poetic introduction to the fourth gospel, particularly emphasizing the incarnation of Jesus. Unlike Matthew and Luke, who are going to offer genealogies of Jesus, Matthew is going to trace Jesus' genealogy back to Abraham. Luke is going to trace Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam. John doesn't do that at least in the sense of a pedigree or a list of ancestors. But what he does do is he concentrates on the origins of Jesus from even before the beginning of the universe, from all eternity in what John is going to call the bosom of the Father, or from the Father's side. So this prologue describes I guess what you could call a cycle. I'm going to call it a cyclical pattern. The Word, the Logos, is going to come from God. He is going to be incarnate in the world as a human being. And then at the end, he is going to return to God. And as it says in one place in the fourth gospel, Jesus says, where I was before. So the prologue describes a cycle. He comes from God, he comes into the earth as a human, and he returns to the Father. And this prologue is going to emphasize many of the major themes in the book. And these would be with key words. One of them is the word logos, which we translate simply as word. But there's also the words light, darkness, life, grace, truth, testimony, the law, and faith or belief. These are very important concepts in the fourth gospel, and these are going to all be mentioned in the prologue right at the beginning. Then follows a lengthy section that that scholars sometimes call the book of signs. Now, that is not a biblical designation. There's nothing in the Gospel of John that says there is a book of signs. But this has become sort of generally accepted terminology by scholars because there is this fairly long section that structures the narratives about Jesus' ministry around alternating signs and discourses. Now, the signs are miracles that Jesus does. These are incidents that become ways of opening up the identity of Jesus. So in that sense, they are signs because they point beyond themselves. Now, sometimes people have a mindset not to believe in Jesus. And so these signs don't work for people who are spiritually blind. In fact, the signs become a revelation to some, but spiritual blindness to others. And we will see that as we go through the Gospel of John. However, it is of interest that in the fourth Gospel, Jesus is only described as performing 7 signs or 7 miracles. Now, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of course, there are many miracles, dozens of them. But in the fourth gospel, the record confines itself to just 7. Now, I don't think that means that the fourth gospel thinks Jesus only did 7. In fact, at the end of his gospel, he's going to say that if everything that Jesus did could be written down, all the books in the world would be sufficient to contain him. So there's this wonderful hyperbole at the end. But he does select out of the incidents that happened in the life of Jesus 7 signs that are particularly important for him. And it is probably to the point to mention that the number 7 is a sort of a symbolic number. It is a mathematical number, of course, but it is also a symbolic number that seems to suggest fullness or completeness. And in these 7 signs, there will be a complete understanding of the identity of Jesus. The first of these 2 signs are numbered. The first one is said, this is the first sign. The second one is numbered, this is the second sign. And that in turn suggests that as you read through the Gospel of John, you should continue that numerical progression for all of the signs. And as you will see in the end, there will be 7 of them. It is also probably important that John uses the term semeion, which is the Greek term for sign. Now, the nature of a sign is that it points beyond itself. In other words, the signs are not just ends in themselves. They are pathways for understanding who Jesus is. In the Synoptic Gospels, the typical word is going to be a mighty work or a miracle. But in the Gospel of John, the word that is usually used is the word sign. And then each of these signs are interspersed with lengthy discourses. Well, at least most of them are. There's a couple of them that they're not discourses, but most of them have a lengthy discourse. And they reflect upon the meaning of the sign. So the sign of turning water into wine, for instance, is a way of talking about life-giving water. And that is a symbol of a spiritual reality. And the feeding of the 5,000, in which Jesus breaks the loaves of bread and shares them with this great crowd. But he immediately goes into the discussion about what is the true bread from heaven. And he calls himself the bread of life. I am the bread of life. And then there's the man who was born blind, and Jesus heals this man. But that introduces the subject of light. Blindness, of course, is darkness, But Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And in saying that, Jesus is not just talking about healing a blind man. He's talking about himself as the light of the world in a much more comprehensive way than simply this single sign miracle. And then finally, there is the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead, which points toward the idea of eternal life, which Jesus will give to those who believe in him. So here are the 7 signs. There is the water turned to wine. Jesus is going to reflect upon that in his conversations with Nicodemus and the woman in Samaria at the well. There's the healing of the official son. There is the healing of the invalid at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. And then there's going to follow this lengthy discourse about true life, which is in the Son of God. Then the feeding of the 5,000. This is on the way to Jerusalem. This is reflected in Jesus' discourse about the bread from heaven. Then there is Jesus walking in the Sea of Galilee. This is one of the very few narratives that actually do happen in the north in Galilee. And then there is the healing of the man born blind, and Jesus' discourse about himself as the light of the world and the good shepherd. And then finally, the last of the 7 signs is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. This then becomes the prelude to the greatest sign of all, which is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Now, I've not included that in the 7 signs because this is not something Jesus does for someone else in the sense of a healing or something like that. But all of these 7 signs are pointing ahead to something even greater. And as you look at the signs, you can see that they escalate in the level of their majesty. Turning water into wine is a wonderful thing, but raising Lazarus from the dead, that has to be the consummate sign of all of the signs that Jesus did. Following what is called the Book of Signs, there's what some scholars will call the Book of Glory. And this is the latter half of the gospel. And it focuses upon Jesus' last appearance in Jerusalem, his arrest, his trial, his passion on the cross, and his resurrection. Consistently, Jesus in this gospel is going to speak about his passion and death as his glorification. Now, that is unique to the 4th gospel. That is something you don't really find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this language of glorification. Jesus, in the narratives of his life and ministry, repeatedly spoke of an hour that is coming, this coming hour. He didn't reveal exactly what it was or when it was, although he mentions it several times. But in the end of the gospel, Jesus is going to say, now the hour has come. And in the Book of Glory, this hour is the hour of his glorification. And his glorification is his being lifted up on the cross. His glory is first associated with the signs, when Jesus turns the water into wine, for instance, which is the first of the signs. It's going to say that Jesus revealed to the disciples his glory. And this kind of statement is going to be made more than once. But it is ultimately in his death on the cross that the glory of Jesus becomes the greatest sign of all, his death and his resurrection. So, at the end of the gospel, in this last section that begins in chapter 13, Jesus is going to teach his disciples directly in a very long discourse of several chapters, actually, that prepares them for the future after he returns to the Father. And repeatedly, he's going to talk about his return to the Father. Previously, his discourses were directed to the crowds at large, but now this last lengthy discourse is going to be directed just to the disciples that are in very close association with Jesus, probably the 12 apostles and maybe a few others besides them. Well, then the 4th gospel is going to close with one final chapter, Jesus' post-resurrection appearance to the 7 disciples in Galilee. This is the one that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the appearance of the beloved disciple as one of the unnamed disciples among these final 7. One of these 7 disciples is the author of the 4th gospel. This last section of the gospel is going to prepare for the revelation of the beloved disciple as the author. Now, as you read the Gospel of John and you run into the language of the beloved disciple, you don't immediately note that it is the beloved disciple who is the author of this gospel. But by the time you get to the end, it becomes clear that the beloved disciple is in fact the one who gives this testimony. And this is withheld until the climax of the gospel at the very end. So his appearance at the beginning is scarcely noticeable. If he is the unnamed companion of Andrew, we probably wouldn't think too much about it, except that we keep running into that sort of thing as we read the gospel. He is one of those who had been with Jesus from the beginning. That seems clear enough. He is certainly present at the Last Supper. He is with Jesus during his trial because he gains entrance to the high priest's courtyard. He is there at the crucifixion. He is the one who's going to see the soldier pierce Jesus' side with a spear. And he is going to be one of those who go to the empty tomb and who come to resurrection faith even before he sees Jesus personally. Now, this person, whether we think of him as John Bar Zebedee or John the Elder, he certainly has to be known in the early community. If he's John Bar Zebedee, of course, he's well known because he's one of the 12 apostles. But even if he should be John the Elder, the idea that there was a rumor among the early Christians that he would not die, that seemed to suggest that he has to be well known, even if he's John the Elder. So again, we don't know for sure whether he's John the Elder or John Bar Zebedee. He doesn't appear by name in the Synoptics under the title John the Elder, so we don't know about him from there. We only know about him from these early testimonials of early Christian leaders in the around the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century. So in the end, I don't know that it is a problem for us that we don't know for sure whether it is John Bar Zebedee or John the Elder. Both of them are eyewitnesses of Jesus. Both of them are witnesses of Jesus from the beginning of his ministry all the way to the end of his ministry. Among those who wrote Gospels, of course, John Mark was not one of the 12 apostles, and Luke was not one of the 12 apostles. So there's obviously not some sort of criteria that a gospel writer must have been one of the 12 apostles. But he could have been John Bar Zebedee, and if so, he would have been one of the 12 apostles. But even if he's John the Elder, he is a close associate of Jesus, one who was with Jesus from the beginning to the end of his ministry, who was with him at critical points, in particular his at the Last Supper, his trial, his death, and his resurrection. And so that brings us to the end of some of the introductory work in the reading of this 4th gospel. And in our next lecture, we will look a little more closely at some of the literary patterns that you find in the 4th gospel, as well as some of the unique theology that is in the 4th gospel.